Let me turn the lights down for you. Last week, Joe Dufek told you about how magma is generated, how it's stored, and how it evolves petrologically and geochemically within the crust. We know that some fraction of this magma reaches Earth's surface, maybe 10 to 20% of it, and it erupts at volcanoes. And so this is what I'd like to talk about today. How is it that magma goes from places where it's stored and generated in the crust or in the mantle to reach the surface and erupt? And I put a question mark at the end of the title here. I'll re-ask that question in a slightly, what I think is a more compelling way, so I can illustrate it visually. Why do volcanoes erupt in so many different ways? It's essentially the same question, but with different words. And to illustrate graphically the nature of this question, let's compare and contrast these two different pictures. Mount St Helens in 1980 erupted explosively. I won't embarrass myself by asking how many people remember this. And it erupted explosively, sending all this ash high up into the atmosphere. From 2004 to 2008, Mount St Helens was also erupting. A few tons per second of lava was being delivered to the surface to make this feature here called a lava dome. Obviously a very different style of eruption. And so the question I'd like to answer today and talk about today is why is it that a given volcano can erupt essentially the same material in these two very different ways? This turns out to be the subject of quite active research. And so the fact that it remains, even though it's a simple question, the fact that it remains largely unanswered may seem a little bit surprising. But I think for the most part, we do understand the processes that govern how magma ascends towards the surface. And so what I'd like to do today is try and describe what some of these processes are and how these processes interact with each other to explain the diversity of eruption styles that we see. We were asked to provide supplementary or complementary reading materials. So what I decided to do today is review some of the ideas published in a review paper that came out earlier this year. And so you can go ahead and look at this review paper for supplementary materials. There are some calculations presented in that paper that I will be showing you today. These are, it turns out, new calculations done for that paper. Finally, if you have any questions, go ahead and interrupt at any time. It's dark in here. I forgot my glasses, but I'll be able to see your questions. But just go ahead and yell. There's roughly 35, 40, 45 minutes worth of material, and we have an hour and 20 minutes, so lots of time for discussion. Any questions before I start? Okay. So we're going to begin with the textbook version of how it is that volcanoes erupt. Right, magma stored at some depth. This is what Joe talked about last week. And these magmas contain dissolved gases. I've listed some here, mostly water as well as CO2. If this magma were to rise towards the surface, what happens to the pressure? Pressure is decreasing, good. And it turns out the solubility of gases, like these gases, decreases with decreasing pressure. So as the magma rises, at some point the liquid becomes supersaturated with respect to these dissolved gases at what I call the saturation surface here. And at some point, these gases come out of solution to make bubbles at what I call the exsolution surface. As this magma keeps rising to the surface, the pressure is decreasing, and so the bubbles are going to expand. And at some point, presumably we get enough bubbles inside this magma. The magma undergoes a process termed fragmentation in this picture. And this is an important process. Right? Below this fragmentation surface, we have a continuous liquid phase, shown in red here. Above the fragmentation point, we have little discrete pieces of magma surrounded by a continuous gas phase. And it's those little pieces of magma that go high up in the atmosphere during explosive eruptions. So it's generally assumed then that the difference between explosive eruptions and those that make things like lava flows is simply that this fragmentation process doesn't happen for some reason. Okay. So the different ideas illustrated here are generally, yes, Raj? I will repeat all the questions. The question is, why are these two surfaces at different depths? Typically, you need to be supersaturated by some amount that is, in fact, the subject of quite active research and controversy in order to nucleate bubbles. Right? And the degree of that supersaturation that you need to nucleate bubbles will tell you how far apart those two surfaces need to be. Other questions about the textbook picture of how volcanoes work?
Is this a two-dimensional stuff, or in three-dimensional it would be Conduit or dikes?
The real world is certainly three-dimensional, of course. For the most part, I think of this as a one-dimensional problem. You're going from one depth up to another. Basically, the flow's all in one direction. So to a good approximation, I think you can develop your intuition and understanding with a one-dimensional picture of how pressure evolves. That being said, for the story I will tell you today, the fact that there are gradients and things across this volcanic conduit are fundamentally important. Yeah?
So when do you go from sort of a porous media flow situation to a pipe flow kind of thing? Or is that even a right way to think about it?
Yeah, so I could have extended this picture, I guess, off to the bottom into the mantle. In the mantle, when you melt the mantle, you have a porous material. You have solid plus dispersed melt inside those pores that somehow is segregated and separates to make magma reservoirs. So I'm assuming this magma reservoir is some kind of volume that contains a combination of liquid with suspended crystals. And Joe Dufek talked about this last week. Is Joe still here? Yeah, maybe Joe should answer the question, but he doesn't have a microphone. So that's an important question, how it is that melt segregates, right, to form dikes that ultimately form magma reservoirs that then become the source for what goes up the conduit. And I'm only going to tell you today about what goes on from here to there. Other questions? Okay. So the different ideas illustrated here are generally, of course, well accepted, but individual processes and properties for this picture are the subject of still quite active research. In particular, the physical and chemical characterization of the different processes that are illustrated schematically here. So to help guide our discussion of how magma goes from the bottom up to the top and then erupts, we're going to subdivide our big question into two sub-questions. First, when, where, and how does that fragmentation process happen? And second, why do we see so much diversity in eruption styles? Okay. So we're going to see that there are three main, or what I call key processes here that interact with each other to govern the ascent and the eruption of magma. And so what I'd like to do first is take you through each of these three qualitatively. We'll then revisit each one of these three processes in a little bit more detail, and you'll see some equations. And then we'll look at the interactions between these three different processes. So let's do this qualitatively first. What causes this magma to rise and ascend through that volcanic conduit is the presence of those dissolved gases that form bubbles when the melt becomes supersaturated. Virtually all volcanic rocks that we see contain bubbles, right, that come out of these gases. There's, in fact, even a style of volcanic eruption called strombolian, caused by the bursting of single large bubbles at the surface. So, bubbles form when our melt becomes supersaturated, and these bubbles are going to grow for three different reasons. First, as the magma rises towards the surface, right, pressure is decreasing, and so the gas is going to expand in response to the pressure change. Second, as pressure decreases, the solubility of our gases in the liquid will decrease, and gases are going to diffuse through the melt into the bubble, and the bubble is going to grow. Third, for the bubble to be able to grow, what does it have to be able to do? It has to be able to expand, and to expand, it has to deform this melt surrounding the bubble. Right? What's going to govern the ability of the bubble then to expand? What physical property? It'll be viscosity, right? If the viscosity of this melt is too high, the bubble will be unable to expand in response to those pressure changes. And we'll see this is fundamentally important in how volcanoes erupt. And hence, viscosity plays a dominant role in everything I'll be talking about today. Okay, so our second key process, presumably to keep magma from erupting explosively, we need to find some way of getting rid of those gases, those bubbles that drive magma to the surface. So I'm going to refer to this process as outgassing, gases because that's what's in the bubbles, out meaning they're getting out. And these gases may escape from the volcanic conduit out the side here or maybe find their way out the top. Actually, from a variety of measurements, we know that gases escape through both pathways. We also know that this process called outgassing must occur to varying degrees because through a variety of measurements we can make, we know that the magma at depth contains lots of dissolved water, so I'll call it wet. And when we see this magma at the surface, it contains very little dissolved water, and sometimes we don't see the bubbles as well. Okay, so how do these gases escape from the rising magma? Well, if you look at a piece of pumice or other volcanic rocks, pumice is a volcanic rock with lots of bubbles in it. Right, here's an SEM picture with a 100-micron scale bar. You can see there are little connections between the bubbles. And it's through these connections the gases can flow and escape from the rising magma. Okay. So our third and final key process is that process we called fragmentation, the breakage of magma into little pieces. What causes magma to break turns out to be somewhat controversial and also the subject of quite active research, in part because there are lots of different ways you can break a liquid. Right, so remember we said as our magma is rising, here's our bubble surrounded by the melt, the pressures are changing, the gas inside is going to try and expand. If the viscosity of this liquid surrounding the bubble is too high to allow the bubble to expand, in response to those pressure changes, we can get big pressures inside the bubble compared to the pressures outside the bubble. And if these pressure differences get too big between the inside and outside, this melt surrounding the bubble is going to rupture, right? And the magma or the melt is going to fragment it into little pieces. And I guess this is a little bit analogous to what happens when you blow air into a balloon, right? You increase the pressure of the air inside the balloon. You generate stresses inside the rubber. If those stresses get too big, the balloon ruptures, right? Physically, it's a little different, but actually, mathematically, it's essentially analogous. Okay. Any questions yet? Okay. So there's a second way in which magmas can break if you deform them too quickly, right? For a liquid to be able to deform in response to applied stresses, its microstructure has to be able to rearrange itself as fast as you're trying to deform it. And if the microstructure, right, the individual molecules can't move with respect to each other, it will be unable to flow like a liquid, and it will become brittle, and it will break. So I try and illustrate this process here, where I plot for a given temperature the maximum deformation rate in black a liquid can withstand before it becomes brittle and it breaks. So let's imagine we have our magma rising through our volcanic conduit. It's rising slowly. The strain rates, right, the velocity gradients are small. Because they're small compared to this maximum deformation rate, so it'll behave in a fluid-like manner. As the magma starts ascending faster and deforming faster because the bubbles are growing, we may reach strain rates now up here that are greater than what the melt can withstand. The melt will become brittle. It'll break into a bunch of pieces. Okay. And this transition from fluid-like to brittle behavior is often called the glass transition. And I know this is a process you're all familiar with. The advantage of being local, right, is I get to bring samples. Right, if you've played with silly putty, right, almost all materials can behave in this kind of manner. So silly putty is a good example. If I pull on silly putty slowly, what's it doing? It's stretching. So what kind of behavior would that be? That's our viscous behavior, right? If I'm strong enough today and I pull fast enough, I can break it into two pieces. Actually, for a little story I'll tell you later if we have time, we should be able to, in principle, go from up here back down to the bottom, right? Just by changing the strain rate. And I can do that by taking my two pieces of silly putty, I put them back together, and if I start pulling them slowly again, what happens? It stretches back like a viscous fluid. So in principle, we can actually go back and forth, right, across these kinds of transitions as well. Oops. Here you go, Robin.
Oh, something to play with.
Okay, so where is magma going to break through this manner if it's deforming too fast? On the left is a schematic illustration of magma rising through our volcanic conduit. I only draw half of it for you. And to answer your question, this is where 2 dimensions may start to matter as opposed to 1 dimension. Right, magma rises fastest in the middle of the conduit, and it's basically stuck to the walls over here on the left, the velocity 0. Where's the velocity gradient the biggest, the strain rate the biggest? What's strain rate? It's a velocity gradient, right? So it should be biggest right here. Right. So if we're going to break our magma because we're deforming it too fast, it should be near the edges of the volcanic conduit. So this has an important implication, in fact, for one of the other of the 3 key processes we talked about earlier, right? The ability of gases to escape from the rising magma. So this is our first chance to think about how these processes interact. Right? You can imagine your magma's rising. Maybe it breaks at the side of the conduit here, right? So now we have a broken up material, and gases will be able to escape from that rising magma much faster. In fact, for 2 reasons. The gases can flow through those fractures we just created, right, between those little pieces of silly putty, for example. And the gases only flow through a porous material like a bubbly rock, looks like a diffusion equation. Right? So the gases only need to diffuse or be transported out of small pieces rather than having to diffuse or be transported across the entire volcanic conduit. right? So that outgassing process could, in principle, become much more efficient. Okay. So two different ways we can break magmas, right? And their consequences, we will see, can be quite different. Okay. So I've tried to talk you through qualitatively the three key processes that interact to govern the ascent and eruption of magma. And just to quickly review, right, this was the nucleation of bubbles and the growth of those bubbles. To prevent eruption, explosive eruption, we need to get rid of those gases. We call that outgassing. And then we need to break the magma to make the little pieces that can erupt explosively. Okay, so what we need to do now is understand how these processes interact to explain the diversity of eruption styles that we see. And people use a variety of approaches to try and understand these interactions and characterize these processes. People do lab experiments and develop theoretical models using both real magmas as well as analog materials to study individual processes and characterize physical and chemical properties. You can simulate the equations for conservation of mass, momentum, and energy to study how this magma rises. And probably the most important, of course, is our understanding and inspiration for all these ideas I've been talking about are based on looking at deposits from real eruptions. And we can, of course, look at measurements we make on rocks to also test ideas from lab experiments or numerical simulations. So I think what I'll do today, I've got about 40 minutes, right, is I'm going to show you the results of some numerical simulations. And because, of course, real rocks matter, I'll show you two examples very briefly to give you a sense of how you can use measurements made on rocks to test some of these different ideas. Okay. Any questions?
Surface of exsolution. Is it a sharp surface as you know it or not?
So the question is that exsolution surface a sharp surface? The answer for sure in reality is no. But pressure should be roughly uniform at a given depth inside the conduit. The temperatures, however, are not going to be uniform. And I'll talk about temperature later on. In addition, bubbles turn out to not nucleate just at a single event, at that one point where they become supersaturated, but there's evidence that there's continuous nucleation or multiple nucleation events as well. Right. And you'll see why later as well, that the way in which bubbles grow will depend on how the degree of supersaturation within the liquid, and if you become too supersaturated, you can nucleate new bubbles again. Okay. And so we'll revisit that answer a couple different times in different ways. Other questions? Okay, so remember I said we're going to revisit those three ideas in a little bit more detail, so let's get started. Okay, so what I'm going to be showing you is the results of a numerical model for magma ascent and eruption, in which we're essentially going to solve the equations for conservation of mass, momentum, and energy. Now, if you think about the problem we would like to understand here, there are two very different scales, both in time and space, right? We'd like to understand what's happening inside our entire volcanic conduit, right? So length scales of several kilometers. But hopefully you got the sense that what really matters here is how bubbles nucleate and how individual bubbles grow. And how big are bubbles? Well, they're small, right? Much smaller than many kilometers for sure, right? They're typically tens of microns in size. So there's relevant physics and chemistry going on at 10 micron scales and kilometer scales. And so what we end up having to do is we solve this problem at two very different scales. Right? At the scale of magma rising through this conduit, we're going to treat our magma. And now I'm going to define what the word magma means. It's bubbles plus our liquid plus any crystals that are present. We're going to treat it as a homogeneous single material and solve the relevant equations at that scale. To figure out what the properties are of this magma, however, what we're going to do is solve a second problem simultaneously for the nucleation and growth of a single bubble, right? And that will allow us to calculate the properties of the melt. And from the scale of simulation at the size of an individual bubble, we will determine properties that affect the large-scale problem. Okay. And these two different problems at two different scales are coupled to each other through the pressure and temperature as well as the rheology. Okay. So for our magma rising inside the volcanic conduit, the equation we need to solve is exactly the same one that Adrian and Shiji and the mantle convection people were solving. And actually Greg Hirth as well, right? We balance viscous stresses, viscosity times a strain rate, by the pressure gradients that are causing the magma to rise. Okay. It's a very simple equation. The real complexity here enters because our viscosity, denoted eta here, is not simple, right? And you learned this morning that rheology of rocks is not simple. It's just as complicated for magmas. It depends on the strain rate. It depends on temperature. Phi is the volume fraction of bubbles. R is the size of those bubbles. And CW is the amount of water dissolved inside the liquid. In fact, I think this morning you saw the same dependence on all these properties, except Greg didn't talk about the volume fraction except indirectly, right, when he talked about his two-component rocks. Okay, and I think that's all I need to tell you, except that in the simulations I'll be showing you, I'm going to assume the flow is steady, right? That is, it's not time varying. So the question is, do we need to take into account crystal content? For the most part, I wasn't going to talk about crystals today because there's two reasons, actually. I began by saying bubbles are everything, right? Nucleating bubbles drives things to the surface, and I didn't want to distract the story with crystals. But during an eruption, in fact, the amount of crystals and the size of those crystals typically doesn't change very much. And so what the crystals do is they will simply modify our reference viscosity. Whereas these other quantities listed here are things that co-evolve during the eruption. But for sure, crystals do matter. Other questions? Okay, so I think I was saying something about the flow being steady. Real eruptions, of course, start and they stop, right? So they're not steady forever. So the steady assumption is really an okay approximation for eruptions that are reasonably long-lived compared to the time scale over which the flow itself is changing. Okay, so I said there's a second scale of problem we need to understand, how bubbles grow. Okay. And our bubbles are going to grow again for a couple reasons. The gas in here will expand as pressure changes. Gases diffuse through the melt into the bubble, and the melt has to be able to flow. Okay. And so we need to know the solubility of gases, and we need to know the diffusivity of gases as well. But people fortunately measured them. Okay, so again, we solve equations that describe conservation of mass, momentum, and energy. I will not define all these terms for you, but at least explain what it is that's going on. Right, so C is the concentration of something that's dissolved. This is basically a diffusive flux that going into the bubble, and so we keep track of conservation of mass for each dissolved species. Our second equation describes conservation of momentum. It says that the driving force causing the bubble to expand on the left-hand side is balanced by viscous stresses. And later I'll show you that viscosity depends a lot on how much water is dissolved in the melt. And the amount of water dissolved in the melt is going to vary quite a bit away from that bubble. Okay. And then the final two equations here that I'll only describe in words account for or statements of energy balance. The gas temperature will change as heat diffuses into the bubble. The second accounts for the enthalpy associated with exsolving those gases. The third accounts for pressure volume changes. Okay. So it turns out there's three different... Rick?
Yeah, Michael, are you concerned with the relative velocity of the bubble relative to the liquid? If you have a low viscosity liquid, the bubbles would rise through it, right? At much higher ascent velocity.
Okay. So Rick's asking an important question. Here I'm pretending that we have a single bubble surrounded by a shell of melt. The bubble's going to expand and stretch that melt. Bubbles are lighter than the surrounding liquid, right? That's what's causing everything to rise. And if the viscosity of the liquid's low enough, the bubble can move with respect to the liquid and separate. So for now, I'm going to ignore that part of the problem, but at the very end, we'll revisit what happens if bubbles can move with respect to the liquid. And that's typically only important in a subset of basaltic eruptions. Yeah. My end point, depending on how we get there, is to make for you something I'll call a regime diagram, where I'll plot viscosity versus how much magma is coming up to the surface, and try and put all types of eruptions on there for you. And so we'll see the limit where bubbles moving with respect to the liquid matters. Other questions?
So I noticed that you actually include, viscous heating in the energy balance. How important is that?
Shiji's asking, turns out what will be a very important question, how important is the dissipation of heat? Dissipation of heat by deformation changes temperature. Temperature affects viscosity. At the scale of the individual growth of a bubble, it turns out not to matter, but for the conduit scale flow problem, it has a profound effect. Yeah. And I'll show you later that is the answer to that question as well. Okay. So there are three different limits under which our bubbles are going to grow. I guess Adrian called these asymptotic limits earlier. And the importance here is that these three different ways in which bubbles grow show up in three different ways in which bubbles form and volcanoes erupt. So in the first case, if the concentration of our dissolved gases in the liquid is at equilibrium with the pressure inside the bubble, and there are no gradients, our bubble is going to grow under what I call here equilibrium conditions. And so the growth of bubbles will be limited by how the solubility is changing, which in turn is controlled by how fast pressure is changing. And the time scale then for bubbles to grow through this process under these conditions simply is the pressure of the magma divided by its time derivative, how fast the magma is rising. Okay. If the concentration of our dissolved gases in the surrounding melt is bigger than that, bigger than the equilibrium solubility, right, gases are going to diffuse towards the melt gas interface at position, right, so the boundary between the gas and the melt is at position R. S is the midpoint between where the next bubble is. The time scale for diffusive transport of these gases into the bubble scales like this length here squared, like all diffusive processes. It goes like a length squared, S minus R squared, divided by a diffusivity D. That's the time scale for diffusive transport of our dissolved gases. Okay. And growth of these bubbles will be limited by diffusion through that melt if the time scale for that diffusive transport, tau diff here, becomes much bigger than the time scale over which the pressure is changing. Right? The ratio of a diffusive time scale to, in this case, I guess it's an advection time scale, a time scale for a system to change, is often called a Peclet number. And in this limit, if it's much bigger than 1, our melt can become greatly supersaturated with respect to those dissolved gases. Right? So in answer to an earlier question, this is when we're going to nucleate new bubbles, when we become highly supersaturated.
Sorry, question.
Yeah.
The viscosity of the melt through time remain constant?
Question, does the viscosity of the melt remain constant through time?
The gassing, basically the melt becomes depleted in fluids.
Yes.
So the viscosity should decrease.
Right. So I will show you some real numbers later. Viscosity depends on how much water is inside this melt, and it will change by 4 orders of magnitude during the course of an eruption. Right. So it's one of the biggest controls on eruption behavior. In fact, I haven't told you anything about the nature of this problem that we solve here. It turns out it's quite complicated, in part for that reason. We have big gradients in viscosity, and it's a free boundary problem. We don't know where that gas-fluid interface is and have to solve for it as part of the problem. Okay, so our final limit, if the viscosity of the melt surrounding that bubble is high enough, right, the bubble will be unable to expand in response to those pressure changes. The time scale for viscous deformation of the melt scales like the viscosity divided by the pressure difference driving that flow. Once again, we can compare then the time scale for deformation to accommodate the pressure changes with the time scale over which the pressure itself is changing. This is analogous to the previous dimensionless number called a Peclet number. It's really, in this case, it's really diffusion through viscosity, or accommodated by deformation. And if this number becomes big, right, basically we're not able to deform the melt fast enough, we're going to get large pressures inside the bubbles, and this is when the melt is going to fragment. Okay? So depending on how the relative magnitudes of different physical properties and chemical properties, bubbles grow in 3 different ways, and we'll see 3 different consequences. Okay, so viscosity clearly matters here, right? It's going to tell us whether we get big pressures inside bubbles and whether the magma is going to fragment. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the rheology of magmas. So let's see. In this particular plot, what I'm illustrating is the relationship between the viscosity of our melt, plotted on the vertical axis on a log scale with real numbers. This axis shows temperature. The other axis is the amount of water dissolved in the liquid. For the most part today, I'm not going to be giving you real numbers because either you know them and you know them, or if I tell you, you won't remember. But here, you need to know a couple numbers. These magmas at depth typically contain, say, 5 or so weight % water. Right, so we may start somewhere down here. Solubility at low pressures at 1 atmosphere is much lower, about 0.1, 0.2%. And so as the magma rises and these gases come out of solution, the viscosity of the melt will change by 4 or 5 orders of magnitude. Okay. This is the viscosity of a liquid. Viscosity of magmas is more complicated, right? Magmas contain bubbles. They contain crystals. Just like Greg talked about this morning, it turns out the strain rate also can affect melt viscosity as well as magma viscosity. Okay, any questions?
Does the composition of the melt play as big a factor?
Yes. The question is, does composition of melt matter? And for sure it does. So this particular composition, I think, is for a haplogranitic melt. And these are pretty big numbers, right? At sort of erupt temperatures and water contents of eruptions, these are 10 to the 10 Pascal seconds. Viscosities of basalt, which have much more silica, will be closer to, say, 100 Pascal seconds. Okay. And so at the end, I will try and make one axis of our map of all types of behaviors be viscosity for exactly that reason. Viscosity is highly variable. Other questions? Did the silly putty get passed around?
No, I've been hogging it.
But
It's so much fun.
it kept Robin awake, right? Okay.
You kept me awake.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to tell you a little bit, give you a flavor for some of the things that affect magma and melt viscosity, just so you can get a sense of some of the things that are going on. This is a plot of viscosity of a melt divided by its viscosity at very low deformation rates as a function of that deformation rate, right? So low strain rates to the left, high strain rates to the right. And at strain rates that plot somewhere over here is when the melt breaks, right? Because you're deforming it too fast. And if you start deforming melt fast enough, its viscosity will decrease with increasing deformation rate. Other things matter. We just said we're making bubbles. The presence of bubbles inside the magma also affects how it's going to deform. Okay. So you want to imagine we have a liquid. It's got a bunch of inclusions, bubbles in it, and we're going to try and deform it. If those bubbles are required to remain perfectly spherical for whatever reason, as you try and deform the melt, the fluid has to pass over and around those bubbles. It's going to look like a more viscous material, and viscosity will be bigger than that of this liquid. Okay. This number here, called the capillary number, is a ratio of two different time scales or forces. The capillary number is the ratio of viscous stresses. Viscous stresses will take something and try and stretch it and deform it. And viscous stresses scale like viscosity times a strain rate. Right? Those are stresses that might act to stretch out our bubbles. What keeps bubbles from deforming is surface tension. And surface tension forces scale like a surface tension sigma divided by a radius of curvature. Right? So this is the ratio of stresses that act to deform bubbles compared to those that try and keep them spherical. So for low capillary numbers on the left here, bubbles will remain close to spherical. And on the far right, they can become highly deformed. This is a picture of what bubbles look like in an example of obsidian. Obsidian's volcanic glass with lots of silicon in it. Okay. So what's plotted, phi is a volume fraction of bubbles. What's plotted here is what the viscosity of our suspension looks like as a function of how fast you're trying to deform it. If the bubbles remain spherical, the viscosity of the suspension is bigger than that of the liquid. The vertical axis I didn't define for you, I should. It's the viscosity of our suspension compared to that of the liquid. On the other hand, at large capillary numbers, if you can deform bubbles like this, the viscosity is lower, right? Because bubbles essentially have no viscosity compared to the liquid. It's easy to deform the gas inside a bubble. And so if bubbles become highly deformed, the viscosity of the suspension is also much lower. I'm only showing you this in part because this is more than an order of magnitude and does affect how these eruptions work. Okay, so our second key process was getting rid of those gases, right? And we said magma is permeable. We looked at a picture of pumice, and we saw connections between the bubbles here. People make measurements of permeability on real volcanic rocks, both those that erupt. They do it in the lab under in situ conditions. So here we have measurements of permeability versus the volume fraction of bubbles. And not surprisingly, right, when you have more bubbles, the permeability is going to be bigger. Again, I'm not going to emphasize real numbers, but these are quite large permeabilities. If these were permeabilities for an aquifer, you'd be very happy. Okay. And what we can do with these measurements is fit them to theoretical models that say that permeability scales like the porosity to some power. And we have to do this because, in the end, I'm going to show you some simulations. We need to know when gases can escape from rising magma. Okay. But qualitatively, you can imagine that gases will be able to escape if the rate of flow through the permeable material, which is governed by an equation called Darcy's equation, is big compared to the rate at which gases are coming out of the magma, coming out of solution. Okay. And I guess for what follows, the importance is that we have good models and data to tell us how gases flow through magma. Okay, so our final key process was that process of breaking magma. Remember, we said there are two different ways to do this. What people do on the left is you take something like you take magma, not silly putty. You stretch it at different rates until you find that it breaks. Okay. And people find experimentally that this happens when the strain rate, the imposed deformation, exceeds something called the structural relaxation time. The relaxation time is the time scale for the microstructure to adjust. And it, in turn, looks like a viscosity divided by a shear modulus. And then there's some empirical constant that you get experimentally. Okay, so that's known on the left. On the right, what people do to figure out how big this overpressure needs to be to disrupt the melt, you can once again do lab experiments. You take bubbly materials, you subject them to ever-increasing pressure differences, and keep track of when things break apart. So here's some experimental data. Vertical axis is the pressure difference needed to fragment bubbly magma as a function of the volume fraction of bubbles inside that magma. And that relationship scales like 1 over the empty space, 1 of the porosity. And I guess one interpretation of a scaling kind of like this is that there's a certain amount of potential energy inside those bubbles, and that scales like the porosity. Okay. So any questions before I start showing you some simulations? Okay, so what I'm going to do is take you through one example in some detail to give you a sense of the different processes that occur. And then I'm going to try and generalize and summarize over all possible conditions. And so the example I picked will be conditions and properties and geometries and melt viscosities that are probably representative of those for the 1980 eruption at Mount St Helens, the 1980 explosive eruption. In the various panels I'll be showing you here, on the vertical axis, I'm plotting depth below the surface. Okay, and our first plot shows pressure inside the magma. Right, and not surprisingly, as you go down, right, pressure goes up. So our next plot shows a volume fraction of bubbles. Right, and at some point, the melt becomes supersaturated with respect to the dissolved gases. We nucleate bubbles. And as the pressure decreases, the volume fraction of bubbles goes up, right, going 0 up to 100%. Ah, good question. Why is the pressure kink right there? Yeah, I stopped plotting the bubble fraction there too, actually. Right, something magical is happening right here. That's where it fragments, right? So I haven't told you anything about boundary conditions. We have to couple what's going on inside the magma up to this point with a model for what's going on in the fragmented magma. Right, so this magma, at least in this model, right, the magma is fragmenting at that particular depth.
Does the depth of that fragmentation change?
The question is, does this fragmentation depth change? In real eruptions, most assuredly, although it's unclear. Getting observational evidence to tell you how it's evolving and where it happens turns out to be quite difficult. Everything I'm doing here, the flow is steady, meaning non-time variable. And so in the simulation, it's not changing. Okay, so as these bubbles are growing because gases diffuse from the melt into the bubble, and so the amount of water in our melt is decreasing, and the viscosity goes up, in this case by about 4 orders of magnitude, right? And in fact, near the end here, the viscosity of the melt is becoming so large that our bubbles are going to be unable to expand in response to further pressure changes. So our final plot, what I'm plotting in blue, is the pressure difference between the pressure inside the bubble and the pressure outside the bubble. And you can see when the melt viscosity gets high, that pressure difference gets big. The red curve shows the pressure difference you need in order to fragment the magma, right? Based on those laboratory experiments I showed you a couple slides ago. So presumably when these two curves meet and cross is when our magma is going to fragment. We're going to make all those little particles of volcanic ash that then can erupt explosively right here. Right. And you'll notice that fragmentation depth, of course, is where the kink is. Questions about the... Yes?
The time scale of this process.
What is the time scale of the process? Okay. the question is, what is the time scale of the process? There are many time scales here. Again, the flow in the conduit is steady, meaning this picture is what it looks like forever. But our bubbles are growing by diffusion. There's a time scale there. There's a time scale for the bubbles to expand. So there are time scales that go down to, I don't know, less than seconds that are relevant. Yeah. And I do know actually what the velocity is here, so I could tell you how long it takes for a parcel of magma to go from the bottom to the top. But I'd have to calculate it based on some graphs coming later.
Can V increase significantly without the bubble size increasing?
The question is, can the total porosity change significantly without the mean bubble size changing? And the answer would be yes, if you start nucleating new bubbles to make. The question is, where's the porosity coming from? If you're not changing the bubble size, you need to add more and more bubbles to do that. And that would happen under circumstances where diffusion is really, really slow. Right? And so typically the faster the pressure is changing, the faster magma is coming to the surface, the greater the number of bubbles per unit volume you would see. So you'd see a larger fraction of small bubbles. Yeah. Cinti?
I know you're not modeling the crystals there, but so I guess this is pretty much constant temperature going on?
The question is this a constant temperature bottom to top? And the answer is no. Things are definitely heating up because we're taking gravitational potential energy, right, and using it to drive things up to the surface. It ultimately goes into heat. The key for what follows, you will see, is where that heat is being dissipated. And that has a big control on what happens. Yeah?
So, Michael, what's the change in the melted water content as the viscosity is changing?
I guess I don't have that plotted here. So I think we're probably going from about 5% to about 0.4%.
Because again, I know you were probably treating crystal content being the same, but degassing itself will cause crystallization.
Yes.
So the crystal content must increase.
Increasing pretty fast.
Yeah. So the comments and questions are about crystals, and are we making new crystals? Should we make new crystals? There is a subpopulation of crystals inside these melts that do form in response to the water being lost from the melt. Little tiny crystals called microlites. I'll have some slides later to show you pictures of them. They typically occupy a 0.1, 0.4 volume percent. Most of the big phenocrysts, and there's lots in this magma, there's not enough time for them to grow or change. And the little tiny crystals presumably don't have a big effect.
Is that a feature of sort of rhyolitic magma only, or similar for basaltic?
In basalts, I think the phenocrysts probably don't have time to do much growth, but the microlites, I think, do nucleate and grow. Yeah.
Michael, you mentioned the temperatures were increasing, but the whole system's decompressing.
Yes.
Why are the temperatures?
Temperatures are only increasing in some areas. I don't have a 2D cross-section of the magma and the conduit. The shear rate's the biggest at the edge, and that's where all the heat is being generated, through shear heating. Yeah. Okay, so what I'm going to do, this is a busy plot. Let me explain the axes, because for the next set of slides, I'm going to try and put everything for high viscosity magmas onto this one plot. Horizontal axis is the rate at which mass is flowing up the volcanic conduit. Right? And I guess we're spanning, 3 orders of magnitude in mass flow rates. You can think about this as being roughly proportional to how fast the magma is rising, something like a speed. Okay. Vertical axis is kind of like the depth axis I was showing you previously, but I plot it as pressure, in part because going from pressure to depth is very nonlinear. Okay. And so surface is up here, greater depths down at the bottom. There are a bunch of names listed here. These are estimates of mass flow rates for some reasonably well-studied volcanic eruptions. And I think I probably emphasized ones from the United States of America or things managed by them. Okay. So, and now we're going to go through all those different processes, right? So the first question is, when does magma become permeable enough to allow gases to escape from rising magma before it reaches the surface, right? And if you can get rid of those gases, we don't get explosive eruptions. So the red curve here, that's being plotted here shows the depth below the surface, at which point the magma is permeable enough that gases can escape from the rising magma faster than they're coming out of solution. Right? So you can imagine you're a parcel of magma rising, you cross over, right? You're making bubbles, and those bubbles aren't leaving because the permeability is not high enough. Eventually you get enough bubbles, the permeability is high enough, the gases start escaping. And if you can get rid of the gases, you don't need to erupt explosively. And these are the kinds of mass flow rates that characterize eruptions that make lava domes, like Mount St. Helens most recently. Okay. So the second process we talked about today was the breakage of magma because we're deforming it too fast. You want to think about the silly putty analogy here. So when is magma rising fast enough that it starts to break at the edge of volcanic conduits? Okay. That's this red curve right here. Okay. So again, magma is rising up to the surface. It's going faster and faster. Eventually, it's deforming fast enough it can break at the sides of the volcanic conduit. And at the time when I first introduced this idea, I said that one importance for removing gases is that you imagine you've got your magma rising, you break it apart at the edge of the conduit, you create cracks that allow gases to escape. If this happens, then you may have a pathway to get rid of gases, and you no longer need to have you no longer get an explosive eruption. And notice there's a range of rise speeds or mass flows right here, where magma breaks apart well before it becomes permeable enough to let those gases escape. Okay. This vertical black line shows an estimate of the mass flow rate for Glass Mountain in Northern California. This is Mount Shasta in the background. I guess we're looking west. The volume of this flow is about 1.5 cubic kilometers, so it's about 3 times bigger than the amount of material that erupted at Mount St. Helens in 1980. This is what we call an obsidian flow. It's very similar to the one Rick Carlson showed you at Newberry Volcano. Okay. Except it's bigger than Newberry. Okay. Right, so this flow, rather than erupting explosively, did erupt to make this big lava flow about 1,500 years ago. And so the idea here is that as the magma rose to the surface, right, it breaks apart at the edges of the volcanic conduit, the gases can escape, and we get an effusive eruption, meaning non-explosive.
Sorry. In this volcanic eruption, the composition of the melt is always the same? The amount of fluid, the amount of silica?
The question is the composition of what's erupting here the same? For the purposes of what I'm talking about today, it's the same. I think, as far as I know, there's no significant change in the chemistry from the beginning to the end of the eruption. For some of these obsidian-forming eruptions, there's often 2 different types of magmas with very subtle differences in the composition, like barium changes.
Between the various eruptions?
Between the various eruptions. Yes, so all the examples I picked here are more or less the same, within an order of magnitude, the same viscosity. Yes. Okay.
Michael, on that figure, so what dictates the initial mass flow rate? Does it change?
Sin-T just asked the most important question. What controls this horizontal, the value on the horizontal axis? And I haven't told you, I'm just pretending it's a parameter that we're free to adjust. In fact, it's not. It's an observation. That's the mass flow rate. And the most important question really is what controls this mass flow rate? This is, in fact, determined by a coupling of what's going on inside the volcanic conduit and wherever the magma is coming from. And so, while I'm treating it as sort of the independent variable here, in fact, it's not. It's a consequence of dynamics. And maybe I'll try and revisit that if I don't forget, because through processes I'll talk about later, right, there should be a natural tendency to bifurcate to either very low mass flow rates or very high mass flow rates on the right. Yeah, so I did this mostly for pedagogic reasons, to try and separate it out, but this in fact is not a control parameter, it's an output, the behavior of the system, the mass flow rate. But you'll bear with me, right? Yeah? Okay. So there is something a bit unusual about the story I'm telling you compared to the textbook picture I began with, right? We said when magma fragments or breaks apart, that's when we get an explosive eruption. And here we're suggesting, I'm arguing, well, magma breaks apart at the edges of the volcanic conduit. The gases start escaping. If we get rid of the gases, we don't get an explosive eruption. And so you might wonder whether there's any observations we can make that tell us this kind of process might happen. So one thing you can do is you can record earthquakes, and you may see earthquakes associated with this kind of process. And people have reported this and written about this. I'll show you something a little bit more visual than looking at seismograms. If you go to this, the obsidian flow I just showed you, or Rick Carlson's flow in Newberry Volcano, or any of the other obsidian flows, you see structure in them. They're not homogeneous, right? You see structure at this scale. This is sort of a hand sample scale, and this is what you see under a microscope. And what's the obvious structure you see here? Yes, there's stripes, and there's layering or bands, right? Basically alternating dark and light. What defines the bands you see here, in fact, you can identify with the thin section. They're little tiny crystals that are typically a few micrometers wide and a few tens of micrometers long at the most. And the colors you see here represent different concentrations of those little crystals. Where different concentrations mean here we're at 0.4% versus 0.2% by volume. Okay. So what I'd like to do now is take a short detour and see, can we look at these rocks and see any evidence that the magma is undergoing that process, breaking apart like our silly putty and sticking back together? Okay, so one thing you can do is look more carefully at the rocks, right? Rather than those three pictures I showed you, you look at more. Okay, so on the top is another example of a piece of obsidian, 10 centimeter scale bar. The panel at the very top is looking perpendicular to the bigger picture. Here's another example. How would you describe that texture? If it was a geology class and you had to name that rock, what would you call it? Yeah, I would call it a breccia too. Right? You've got broken up angular fragments, except here they've stuck back together, right? And they've been deformed just a little bit. So, Robin, here's another example, right? No, if you really like it. There's 1.5 cubic kilometers of that. And it's Forest Service land. It's not a national monument yet. Okay. So I would argue this is textual evidence, right, for the process we've been talking about. Again, think silly putty. You break the magma into a bunch of pieces, and then you stick them back together. You get the gases out, you stick them back together. Right? And when you stick them back together, there's no reason they can't go back to flowing. Okay. So we can characterize the structure we see in those bands. We can take, for example, we can measure the structure in a variety of techniques using a variety of different measures. I'll show you just one example here. What I'm plotting on the vertical axis is the power spectrum. This is a power spectrum. Power is a function of the wavelength of the structure. So it's a measure of the amount of variability of color as a function of the size of that we're looking at. And what we see is a 1 over wave number scaling until we get to length scales here that are the size of the individual crystals that define the color variations that we see. Okay. So here's the idea for how we make those bands. Right? We have our magma rising the conduit, same picture I showed you earlier. Strain rates are the biggest at the edges here. We break the magma into a bunch of little pieces. The gases escape from those pieces. They stick back together, and they get stretched again. Okay. So we can come up with a toy model to describe this process and use that toy model to explore what kind of properties of the bands we expect to see. So I'll explain the toy model on the right and on the left. On the right is the physical picture that we're trying to capture or represent. So we take our magma, we break it up into a bunch of pieces with some prescribed size distribution. Okay. And then we're going to let the color of those fragments change. And why does the color change? Gases come out of solution, or water comes out of solution, and we start nucleating the little tiny crystals that define the color that we see. So here we couple the size to the color change. Right? These pieces are being broken up, the magma is rising, so they get jumbled up together. You get rid of the gases, they stick back together, and then they can get stretched. Okay, so here we're going to let the color change, reorient the pieces, stick them back together, stretch them, and presumably this process can happen multiple times. So on the right is an example of a synthetic structure made through this kind of process. And what we can do is compute various statistical properties of structures like this and compare them with observations we make on real rocks. And so what we find is this kind of process illustrated here can reproduce the power law characteristics I showed you a couple slides ago, as well as other attributes I haven't described, such as multifractal characteristics. I guess there are many ways you can reproduce these structures. The key, though, to reproducing the statistical properties of real volcanic rocks is that you have to couple whatever makes the pieces and the size of those pieces with whatever's causing the color change, and do this repeatedly upon itself.
Michael, are the black areas degassed?
The question is, are the black areas degassed? Actually, so we do measure water concentration right across this band. It's basically 0.14% plus or minus 0.02%. So everything is degassed. So these magmas started with about 6% by weight water. And sometime between when they were generated and when they reached the surface in that flow, they really did lose all their gases. Right?
Well, I guess meters, vesicles. Are there any vesicles?
Well, you can look at the sample, you see almost no vesicles. Some of the little fragments, the really, really white ones, have lots of little, these ones here have lots of little tiny bubbles of 30 volume percent. But for the most part, it's pretty dense glass. And the dissolved water content is almost exactly the same through the entire sample. Sometimes we do see gradients in water concentration, which you would expect if there's water diffusing from one place to another. Yeah. And we see that next to cracks and other features where we can see remnants of the diffusion process in the water concentrations. Okay, other questions? Okay, so what we're going to do, maybe you can see a pattern, right? We're gradually increasing the mass flow rate left to right. Now we're going to get to conditions that probably represent those for the ascent and eruption of the monocrater obsidian flows. In fact, anyone who flew from the East Coast probably flew right over these on the way here. Right? If you look just south of Mono Lake, you'll see a chain of domes. There's one chain called the Mono chain, and there's another one called the Inyo chain. And all of these eruptions began with an explosive phase that deposited this pumice that you see, the white stuff you see right here. And then it was followed by an effusive phase to make the lava domes right there. Okay. So here's the idea. Magma is rising up towards the surface. It breaks apart to allow gases to escape. But it's still rising fast enough that eventually whatever bubbles are left in the middle of the volcanic conduit still get large enough pressures inside them that the magma will fragment. So what is this black curve? This is the point as magma is rising towards the surface and getting progressively more viscous, that the viscosity becomes large enough, bubbles can't expand to accommodate the pressure change, and the magma fragments. So if these are the conditions here, then when this erupts explosively, we might expect to see a mixture of a bubbly rock as well as a rock that has lost its bubbles as it rose to the surface. And if you go to these flows and you look at the stuff that looks white here, you can see it's got a mixture of obsidian. So obsidian's dense glass and glass with lots of bubbles in it. Okay. So that was the beginning of these eruptions. They were explosive eruptions. And then it was followed by making these domes. And so one interpretation of what might be going on is that over time, the eruption rate decreases. Why might eruption rate decrease over time? Yeah, we're evacuating a chamber, right? So pressure driving stuff to the surface might be going down. So maybe we move from the right to the left. Now we're rising fast enough to break apart the magma, but not fast enough to get big pressures inside the bubble. Okay. So this will be our last example of looking at real rocks again, because this figure I'm showing you here, of course, is based on just solving a bunch of equations. But we are keeping track of, when we solve these equations, things that we can measure on rocks, right? These bubbles are growing because gases are diffusing from a liquid into a bubble. And so we should be able to go to these rocks and see, are those gases there in abundances that we expect to be at least qualitatively consistent with what we're computing or predicting. Okay. So this is what I'll do next as an aside. Okay. Right, so remember how our bubbles grow. Water diffuses into the bubble. CO2 diffuses into the bubble. And if the magma is rising fast enough, the concentration of these dissolved gases will not necessarily stay in equilibrium with the pressure inside the bubble, but will be diffusing towards that bubble. And the key tool we're going to take advantage of here is that CO2, carbon dioxide, diffuses about 10 times slower than water. So if we were to measure concentrations of CO2 or water through this melt shell, if we were able to do this during the eruption, we'd see that carbon dioxide is further away from equilibrium than water is on the top. Okay. So Newman and co-authors and many other people since have measured the amount of water and CO2 dissolved in glasses from those eruptions, as well as a whole bunch of other eruptions, of course. And so their data is plotted here. Let me explain our axes. Vertical axis, we'll start with the inset. Actually, both figures. The vertical axis is the concentration of CO2 in parts per million. Horizontal axis is concentration of water in weight percent. Okay, and let's start with these three curves. The bigger panel is simply the same data on the top, but we magnify this region here where all the data is clustered. Okay. Now, there are a bunch of theoretical curves on here, or two theoretical curves and one numerical curve. And these are relevant, so I'll have to explain them. The one called open corresponds to what is called open system degassing. And that corresponds to the case where as the magma is rising and gases come out of solution, you simply remove them from that rising magma. And you predict a certain evolution of CO2 concentration and water concentration. The curve labeled closed corresponds to the case where the gases that come out of solution stay inside the bubbles, and those bubbles stay in contact with the liquid from which the gases are coming out of solution. Okay. And you can see these two curves have a small problem, right? What is their small problem? They predict small amounts of CO2 remaining inside the melt, right? And solubility of CO2 is much lower than that of water. In the measurements, we see much higher carbon dioxide concentrations than you would expect for equilibrium gas loss from a liquid. So our interpretation, or one interpretation of those high CO2 concentrations, is that the gases are being lost under non-equilibrium conditions. The loss of gases is limited by diffusion through the melt into the bubbles. And because CO2 diffuses more slowly than water, its concentrations in the remaining melt end up being higher. Okay. To get this particular black curve, this is just one of a whole suite of possibilities. We need a specific ascent rate, which controls the time scale for pressure changes. But the ascent rate it takes to get this black curve is basically the one I was showing you on the previous plot. So in the end, I tried to take you through qualitatively two examples of how you can look at a rock and see if you can test or look for signatures of these different processes that we began by talking about. Okay. So in our previous plot, we said as magma is rising towards the surface, stresses at the edge of the conduit are big. That's where magma is going to break apart. Does this always have to happen? Right? Because as we increase this ascent rate, the speed at which magma is rising, you'd expect things to deform faster and be even more likely to break. Well, let's go back to this glass transition idea we talked about before, where we plot the maximum deformation rate in black that a magma can withstand. Right? So we start deforming slowly, we're fluid-like. We deform too fast, we become brittle. Right? And when I drew an arrow on here before, we assumed we're increasing deformation rate at a fixed temperature. Right? If you rub your hands together, what happens? If you push your hands together even harder, Adrian, what happened to your hands?
My hands getting hot, Michael.
Your hands are getting hot. Yeah, right. So if there's a process analogous to that inside a volcano, right, the temperature may go up. And you may be able to follow a curve kind of like this red one, right, where the temperature's going up and you have to deform even faster to undergo this transition to a brittle behavior. And that process is, in fact, exactly analogous to rubbing your hands together. It's dissipation of energy to make heat through viscosity. Okay, once again, there's another dimensionless number here that characterizes the rate at which you're dissipating heat. It's proportional to the deformation rate squared. And we can compare the rate at which you're making heat, because you're deforming the magma, with the rate at which heat is being conducted to the surrounding rock. Okay, and that's what this dimensionless number labeled BR here characterizes. Making heat compared to losing heat. And if you can make heat fast enough, right, the temperature may go up, and you may follow a trajectory like this and never end up breaking.
Is that greater for polymerized melts?
The question is this greater for polymerized melts or for depolymerized melts? I haven't talked about polymerization at all, but one way to think about these melts is you've got a whole bunch of silica tetrahedra. And just like in mineralogy, you learned how they all sort of get together to make structures. They kind of do that in the melt phase as well. And what the water's doing, it's sort of separating those tetrahedra. So melts that are nicely often called polymerized, where the tetrahedra are well connected, have high viscosities. So what does a high viscosity do for you? All else being equal, right, this ratio becomes big, and heating becomes more important. So in low viscosity magmas, this number is small. Of course, they rise faster too, right? I haven't defined any of these terms for you. Q dot is the flux of mass to the surface. Okay. And low viscosity magmas might rise faster, right? So this might be bigger and this is smaller. But in fact, overall, for the most part, more viscous magmas, this effect is more important. So the answer to your question is yes. Okay. Right. So let's just look at the plots on the far right. On the right, I'm plotting the rate of generating heat or changing temperature as a function of position inside the conduit. 0 is the middle of the volcanic conduit. 25 meters is the far edge. Okay. And these are two different stages during the eruption. Early on in big red, and near the end, just before it fragments with the dashed line. Okay. And where's all the heat being generated? It's at the edge of the volcanic conduit, where the deformation rate is the highest. And it has, besides inhibiting this fragmentation process, it also changes how magma rises inside the conduit. Right? Earlier I showed you a velocity varying with position that looked like the solid blue curve. If the viscosity is very low at the edge of the volcanic conduit, basically everything in the middle rises at the same speed, and the velocity gradients are biggest right at the very edge here. And so to go back to Sinti's question, oh, I thought you were asleep, Sinti, sorry. Right. The horizontal axis I've been plotting is mass flow, right? And he asked the important question, well, what controls mass flow? When the mass flow rate is high, the velocities are high, you make a low viscosity area on the far left, right? Which reduces the overall resistance to ascent inside the volcanic conduit. And so for the most part, I think these eruptions should transition to high mass flows because you have a low viscosity layer on the outside, or low mass flows, the left-hand side of the plot. Okay, so the blue curve here now shows the point during, right, again, magmas are rising up, pressure's changing at a given mass flow. The blue curve shows the point during ascent when you're making enough heat that the magma is unable to break apart. Okay. This black curve is the same one from before. This is the depth or pressure at which the pressure of gases inside the bubble becomes large enough for the magma to fragment because the viscosity of the melt is too high. Okay. Estimates of mass flow rates for Mount St Helens are indicated by the black line. So viscous dissipation of heat, to answer the question early on in the talk, is important, right? It's keeping the magma from breaking apart. This means all the gases stay inside the magma to make bubbles that ultimately can fragment later on to drive the eruption. And we talked about Pinatubo the other day, so here's Pinatubo even farther to the right in 1991. Okay. Any questions? Okay, so as has been pointed out a number of times, this is for a single specific viscosity, for a high viscosity magma. And as Rick asked earlier, bubbles can move with respect to the surrounding liquid if the viscosity of the liquid is low. And the vast majority of magma that erupts on Earth's surface is basalt in composition, and basalt, by comparison, has much lower viscosities by many orders of magnitude. Okay, so what happens in the low viscosity limit will depend on whether the bubbles can move with respect to the surrounding liquid. And how these bubbles behave depends on the size of the bubbles and their concentration. If the concentration of bubbles is low and the bubbles are small, right, the bubbles basically move with the liquid. In fact, this is what we've been assuming up until now. If the bubbles can move with respect to the surrounding liquid, they can merge with each other, they can coalesce, and we might be able to make really big slugs of gas. Right? And if we have enough gas, we can have a continuous gas phase with little droplets of liquid. Okay. So what I'm going to do now to end is try and generalize to other viscosities of magmas. So let me try and explain the axes here too. Vertical axis is the mass flow rate to the surface, and I rescaled it to a speed, assuming a certain conduit size. Right? So the vertical axis on this plot is what used to be the horizontal axis on the previous plots. Right? So low mass flows on the bottom, high eruption rates on the top. The horizontal axis this time is viscosity. High viscosity on the right, and our basalts plot over here on the left. And so what we had been looking at previously when I was plotting depth versus mass flow rate was basically a vertical slice from the right-hand part of this graph. Right? And so we said that at low mass flow rates over here, for high viscosities, we make things like lava domes. Right, so here's a picture of a different lava dome. And this black curve shows, right, for a given viscosity now, the point, an eruption in which eventually before eruption, you get big enough pressures inside bubbles to fragment the magma. Okay. So why is this black curve moving off to the left, upper left on the plot? In fact, the slope is probably 1 on there, right? What does it mean that it's moving? There's a sloping line. It means as we lower the viscosity, right, moving from the right to the left, we're lowering viscosity. We have to deform ever faster in order to get big pressures inside the bubble. We have to rise even faster to get big pressures inside the bubbles. Right, and that's because whether or not we get big pressures inside the bubbles depends on the rate at which you're changing pressure compared to viscosity, which allows the melt to deform. And if we get down to viscosities appropriate for basalt, can we ever get big pressures inside bubbles? I guess you can extrapolate this curve way up there, and if you have ascent speeds of many, many kilometers per second, maybe. Right? But that's way too fast. Okay. So basalts, when they erupt, can never undergo that process, right, where bubbles burst because they get big pressures inside them. Okay, so let's now look at the low viscosity limit on this plot. Right, low viscosity is again over here on the left. This black curve shows, I guess, anything below this black curve shows the case in which bubbles can move enough with respect to the surrounding liquids that you expect them to be able to separate and start forming big gas slugs. Okay. And it's at low mass flow rates over here on the left that you get a style of volcanic eruption that people call strombolian, basically bursting of big bubbles, or they erupt very large bubbles. If you increase the mass flow rate to numbers somewhere in this range, the bubbles move with the liquid. They don't have time to separate. And this is when we get things like lava flows. And it turns out basaltic magmas can erupt explosively, but in a different style from Mount St. Helens, for example, I showed you earlier. There are types of eruptions called fire fountains, and these fire fountains can extend to vertical heights of about 1 kilometer for the largest ones. Right, so I guess you can call this an explosive eruption, but the mechanism by which they erupt is fundamentally quite different. And anything above this black line corresponds to the case where the magma rising to the surface has so much inertia that it's going to continue to flow, continue to stretch, even after it reaches the surface. Right? And so if you have a parcel of fluid and it's continuing to stretch, it's going to stretch into make nice long threads or maybe little droplets. And if you look at the textures of rocks produced during these fire fountains, right, they tell you they're undergoing a brittle fluid-like behavior, not brittle deformation. You have these long threads of liquid and little droplets. Okay. So obviously this is a greatly oversimplified picture of how volcanoes work, right? But in the spirit of what Adrian has been trying to communicate, it's about as simple as you can get to try and sort of understand, at least qualitatively and maybe quantitatively, the feedbacks between those 3 different processes. Any questions? Okay, I'm going to show you one slide, and then I'm going to recap. So another way of thinking about everything I've been talking about is with those dimensionless numbers that, of course, have popped in every now and then, although I haven't always shown them to you. Right? And again, what are these dimensionless numbers? They tell us about the relative importance of different timescales or different processes. And each one of these different dimensionless numbers in certain limits is being represented in what these volcanoes do under certain limits. So for example, when we talk about bubble growth, we said there are these 2 different things called Peckley numbers that characterize diffusive transport compared to pressure changes, or viscous flow compared to pressure changes. If diffusive growth is too slow, then we get supersaturated melt, and that's when we nucleate new bubbles, for example. In the other case, if bubble expansion is retarded by viscosity, right, characterized by that dimensionless number, that's when we get big overpressures and the magma fragments. We saw this again with this thing we call the Brinkman number, the importance of making heat through viscosity compared to conduction of that heat to the surroundings. Our rheology of the magma is once again characterized by a whole slew of dimensionless numbers that characterize some process relative to the deformation rate. So we probably could have made that same plot I showed you previously by plotting a bunch of dimensionless numbers on the axes, or at least identifying where each one controls a certain process. So here's our textbook picture then of how volcanoes work, where we added just a couple extra details. Again, magma is driven to the surface by dissolved gases that make bubbles. Right. The key to preventing explosive eruptions is to get rid of those gases inside those bubbles. Only for the slowest rising magma is the magma permeable enough to allow gases to escape. If the magma goes fast enough, it can start breaking apart, right, to create pathways here for the gases to escape. If the magma goes still faster, you make enough heat, the magma can no longer break apart. Instead, all the gases stay inside the magma. Eventually, the pressure inside those bubbles gets big, the magma fragments, and we get an explosive eruption. So I think we still have 10 minutes for discussion. Okay. Chi.
You showed a diagram where when you have heat dissipation increasing, it makes it more difficult for brittle or for fracture to happen, or fragmentation to happen. So the volcano becomes less explosive. Okay. So if the strain rate is constant, is taken to be something constant, then higher viscous heating means higher viscosity, right? And so
lower viscosity, right?
Yeah, higher viscosity. Higher viscous heating means higher viscosity.
The opposite, right? More viscous heating means more heat, and at higher temperatures, viscosity is lower.
Well, the rate of viscous heating, it becomes greater if you add a constant strain rate if the viscosity is higher. Okay. Now, yes. Your curve seems to suggest if the magma is more viscous, then it's less explosive. If the strain rate is the same.
Okay, so let me see if I can do a much better job, or something even approaching a decent job, trying to explain what's happening. Okay, this is a cross-section of our magma rising the conduit. Initially, it starts isothermal, same temperature everywhere. Strain rates are biggest at the edge, so that's where we make more heat. Temperature goes up, viscosity goes down. When viscosity goes down, the deformation rate gets even bigger. And so we go from the solid blue curve to the blue dashed curve. Right? So the viscosity at the edges is going down, but the strain rate is going up. In the middle, notice the strain rate is going down, so the viscosity and temperature will not be changing much in the middle of the volcanic conduit. So if I were to plot temperature as a function of radius, it's low in the middle and would gradually go up. Okay, so it's gone up enough on the outside of the volcanic conduit that we no longer go through that failure mechanism that's caused by strain rates that are too big. Right? Think about the silly putty example there. In the middle of the conduit, however, ultimately we get an explosive eruption. Temperature hasn't changed. Viscosity is still high in the middle. And because the viscosity in the middle of the conduit's high, we can still get big pressures inside the bubble. So viscosity is varying across the volcanic conduit by a lot, by a couple orders of magnitude, if I remember right. So the key is really that there are two different ways the magma breaks or fragments. Right? It breaks on the side because the strain rates are too big, and it breaks in the middle because we get pressures inside the bubbles that are too big. That's the hypothesis.
Any other questions?
Oh, at the back.
Oh, hey. Yeah, you got.
So, my sense is that the most violent eruptions are island arc eruptions because felsic, a lot of water, they're just the worst. We've started exploring submarine volcanic eruptions, and when we started, it was okay, these things are not going to be violent because you've got so much water pressure, hydrostatic pressure on top of them, the bubbles can't grow. But what we find are two things that are really very difficult to explain. One of them, with eruptions at just a few hundred meters water depth, are these huge megadunes where there are wavelengths of a kilometer or more and amplitudes of 100 meters or more, extending out for 30 meters from the volcano, 30 kilometers from the volcano. Simply, what mechanism could make that? The other one that's completely puzzling us was an eruption in May of 2010 of a volcano, and Doug Weens has helped us find this. It was 200 meters below sea level, and it blasted into the stratosphere. And we simply have. Is there any insights from these kinds of considerations that we should keep in mind as we try and puzzle through these things?
Okay, so there are lots of things embedded in the comments you made. What water pressure does is it changes basically a pressure boundary condition at the surface. And the first statement you made, I think I would disagree with, actually, that the most violent, largest eruptions are often in continental settings. I think about Yellowstone, for example. And I wouldn't call that an island arc or a continental arc. It's far enough away from the actual arc. But submarine volcanism is really cool, right? Yeah. There was an eruption in August last year off of New Zealand, 1,200 kilometers. And the volume that erupted was 4 times bigger than the volume of material that erupted at Mount St Helens in 1980. And it took people 12 days to realize that the eruption happened. That's mind-boggling that an eruption can be that big and unknown, and it was only known because a passenger on a commercial aircraft saw this raft of pumice floating over the ocean. Right. But that one, I think, mostly made pumice that ended up floating up to the ocean, much of which stayed submarine. Water depth there, I think, was 1.6 kilometers, if I remember right. So big enough to suppress nucleation of enough bubbles, maybe. But as things continue to rise in the water column, right, as long as it's hot enough, the bubbles can continue to grow, and so you can still get explosive eruptions, even in submarine settings, as long as the magma gets to low enough pressures that the bubbles can grow.
Any more questions?
I can repeat the question.
It's a stupid question, but so you've got the fragmentation depth. Sorry. Okay. So you've got the fragmentation depth, and this is the point where the viscosity of the magma is high enough that you've got the pressure in the bubbles explode. So what about you've still got the pressure you've still got the driving force? Doesn't that inhibit the flow of magma up the conduit? So would that affect the explosivity of an eruption?
Okay, so the question is really about what is the role of the driving force causing magma to rise to the surface. There are two things causing magma to rise in that conduit. There is some overpressure in the source, but that's probably quite small. And then there's buoyancy. There's a difference in density. And you may remember some of those plots of pressure versus depth, even below the fragmentation point, were highly curved near the top. And that's a consequence of density changing rapidly as these bubbles start to nucleate. And that really dominates. And that's why bubbles are so important. They create buoyancy, they change the density to drive things upwards. Yeah. Comments are good too, rather than questions. Yeah.
So Newberry followed exactly the pattern you showed for Glass Mountain, where you get very fine ash followed by. So you get very fine ash followed by this, it's sort of a mixture of dense obsidian and sort of frothy obsidian. But the interesting thing there is you also get bubbles that grow to 2 to 3 meters in diameter in the flow itself. So you have enough gas left behind to form these, and you have some material property that lets you get meter-sized bubbles.
Yes, so turns out most of these, the western United States has lots of Holocene obsidian flows. And I think they all, or most of them, began with an explosive phase, followed by extruding volumetrically a much larger amount of obsidian. The domes themselves have more volume than the explosive component. interestingly, the amount of magma that erupts during the explosive phase is roughly sort of a conduit worth. So it could be that there's a good chance everything I told you today is just completely irrelevant for the observation, in the sense that I said things were steady. I think the concepts and the processes undoubtedly must happen to some extent. But it could be that basically there's a magma in a dike or some conduit. It's basically being evacuated. The fragmentation surface progresses downward, and then things leak out after that. The big bubbles in Newberry are kind of interesting. It's not clear whether they're big bubbles or basically folds that sort of wrap over on top of themselves, too.
They're pretty round, and
yeah.
You can see the liquid dripping into them from the roofs and stuff.
But it all formed at high temperature, so there's lots of chance for them to evolve as they're forming. So I don't know the answer. There's a paper in JVGR about those big bubbles in Newberry, looking at little structural features to try and understand how they form. Shiji?
Yeah, I got two questions. And so, now on this diagram, and you actually mentioned that you have a much larger strain rate close to the walls. I was kind of curious if actually are there have people gone to the field and to kind of see the differences in terms of strain rate that you can measure? Is that a possible thing to do, or like it's just do a kind of profile?
Yeah. Okay, so Shiji's asking whether there's anything we can measure that tells us that the strain rate is varying across a conduit. I'll try and give you an answer, and then Claude and Joe may come up with something better. One thing that the faster you deform something, the more strain you accumulate, the more things like bubbles will deform. And indeed, if you look at volcanic rocks, you see bubble deformation to a range of degrees. There's a type of pumice with long stretched out bubbles that looks like wood that people call tube pumice. And that could be the kinds of pumice that is produced over here on the side where you have high strain rates. Certainly people have interpreted it that way. But you would have to be able to reconstruct in stuff that erupts explosively where it actually came from in the volcanic conduit. And that's not so easy because it all gets mixed up in the eruption column.
Yeah, I guess the other question is, I guess earlier Rick asked you about this expansion as I guess magma rise and all that, and I guess I wasn't so sure how you answered that. And it looks like you actually consider the viscous heating, right? And so it's just kind of in your energy balance, and so I guess I'm drawing the comparison with the convection. You typically if you include the viscous heating, and then you may also want to include the heating from, well, essentially expansion, the adiabatic heating and all that. So I was kind of curious. I guess I didn't see that in your equation. Maybe you consider
I can go back and show them to you, but they're all there in both scales of problem. At the conduit scale and the energy balance, we're conducting heat, we're advecting heat, and we are producing heat by viscous dissipation. The same is even true at the bubble scale. Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, of course.
In these models, you are considering that the magma is free to flow in the conduit. But, there is the possibility that the conduit is blocked, is stuck in some way.
Yeah, so the question is, I basically assume we have some kind of pipe and magma's rising through it. Geology has to make that pathway. It's not there to start with. And as the fragmentation surface evolves up and down, you might expect the conduit to collapse. You're also entraining material. If you look at deposits from these explosive eruptions, there's surrounding rock that's being entrained. So conduit width or dimensions are certainly changing. You have to make that conduit. I think one of the first order questions I don't think there's a good answer to is why there are volcanic conduits in the first place. Right? When magma first moves through the crust, it makes dikes, right? Big cracks. But no one will argue if you go to a place like St Helens or any real volcano, there are real conduits, right? Magma's eruption is localized to a point. For basaltic eruptions, there are nice models to explain some of the feedbacks that take a fissure eruption and localize the vents. But for these silicic eruptions, I don't think it's well understood. And maybe someone has an idea, but yeah. So the answer to your question is, for sure, it's way more complicated than a straw inside the earth through which things are rising.
So
imagine, but there's no conduit there. They just come from the base of the crust or deeper. How do you explain kimberlite eruptions?
Kimberlites flowed through a conduit. There's no way to go from one place to another without following a pathway. Whether that conduit is preserved is a different issue, but I think when I haven't worked on kimberlites, I haven't visited any, but when I see talks at meetings, people definitely have exposed conduits, especially the vent facies. And those vents are really quite interesting, actually, because it provides a window into the dynamics within the conduit. And there's definitely recycling of material going on. Things are not just going up, they're going up and down and being reworked. But for sure there's a conduit. Maybe, Rick, have you worked on kimberlites?
I mean, the other observation of that is that some kimberlites bring up half-meter diameter xenoliths. And the only way you get a half-a-meter xenolith through the mantle, I mean, from 200 kilometers deep, is to have a half or 1 meter wide conduit.
Yeah.
So, but they close up after they're done, but they're there when the eruption's occurring.
Well, they should. Any hole deeper than a few kilometers should close. In fact, if fragmentation depths reach, hundreds of meters to a kilometer or more, at some point they should collapse as well, if you don't sustain them.
Is there anything really special that needs to happen with a very large-scale eruption like Tambora or something, or the one in Indonesia 70,000 years ago? Is that when you get to very large scales, same physics apply, or do you have to worry about new things?
I don't see any reason why the basic physics here shouldn't apply for every type of eruption. Of course, for a really big eruption, you need a lot of magma. And for sure, those eruptions are so big. They're caldera-forming eruptions. The location of individual vents is probably moving in time as the caldera floor collapses. So there are external processes that modify the pathways for ascent. But the basic physics of why things are erupting and how they're erupting shouldn't be different. But big changes in geometry over the course of an eruption. A good question, though, is, what limits the size of volcanic eruptions? Is there a maximum size, and why are they as big as they are? And why doesn't that stuff erupt earlier on? Okay. I know we're 5 minutes over time for coffee, and I've got to get to a baseball game to pick up kids.